Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Kennan, A Life Between Worlds, by Frank Costigliola. Narrated by Brion. Preface. The greatest tragedy in the life of George F. Kennan arose from his most famous success. As the author of The Long Telegram and the X article in 1946 to 1947, Kennan urged that the United States contain the expansion of the Soviet Union. Thereafter, he could not shake his association with a vastly more militarized version of containment pursued by the United States throughout the Cold War. Kennan also failed in what became his central mission from 1950 onward. With the Kremlin contained, Kennan sought desperately to get Washington to negotiate with Moscow to defuse the threat of nuclear war. Despite their bluster, the Soviets repeatedly signaled their openness to such diplomacy. Kennan remains a largely unsung hero for his persistent efforts to cease the Cold War long before the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Indeed, the story of Kennan's life demands that we rethink the Cold War as an era of possibilities for dialogue and diplomacy, not the inevitable series of confrontations and crises we came to see. As early as February 1948, the author of Containment was already musing about talks with the Kremlin to reduce tensions over defeated Germany. He helped initiate the negotiations that would end the Korean War. In 1952, as ambassador to Moscow, Kennan tried so hard to jumpstart diplomacy that he instead set off an explosion that wrecked his mission. His BBC radio broadcasts in 1957, calling for a mutual U.S.-Soviet military pullback from Europe, inspired a groundswell of public support that shook the Cold War establishment. In 1961 to 1962, as ambassador to Belgrade, he opened a diplomatic channel back to the Kremlin in hopes of easing the Berlin crisis. Kennan's February 1966 televised testimony against the Vietnam War and his critiquing the containment doctrine justifying it helped make such opposition respectable. In the 1970s to 1980s, he became a leading voice calling for an end to the nuclear arms race and a sharp reduction in suicidal weaponry. Even after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Kennan, now in his 90s, did not rest. Having helped instigate one Cold War with Russia in the 1940s, he tried in the 1990s to head off another such conflict. In his public writings and in conversations with the White House, he warned that expanding the NATO alliance into the former domains of the Soviet Union would incite nationalism and militarism in Russia, doom its infant democracy, and poison relations with the West, effectively restarting the Cold War. Though honored, Kennan was not heeded. As he predicted, the enlargement of NATO to the border of Ukraine would spark fury in Moscow, contributing to Russian leader Vladimir Putin's decisions to attack Ukraine in 2014 and to launch a brutal full-scale invasion in 2022. Kennan's role as both the author of Containment and the critic of its implementation reflected not a contradiction, but rather a sophisticated intelligence. His thinking blended keen emotions with keen reasoning. Though Washington insiders could not deny Kennan's brilliance, they tried to limit his influence. Kennan would remain contained by his own containment doctrine. This was not only because he had sold the approach so effectively that it would forever be associated with his name, but also because most leaders in government dismissed his urging that they advance from restraining the Soviets to negotiating with them. Dorothy Fosdick, an influential foreign policy advisor in Washington from the 1940s to the 1980s, and the only woman on Kennan's policy planning staff, later recalled that we from time to time debated whether it not be a good idea to bring Kennan back into government as a way to make him more sensible. The Containment George was the George I respected as a public official, not the later one. This book aims to liberate Kennan from containment by exploring the full range of his political ideas, as well as the connections between those beliefs and his feelings. Kennan's love for the people and culture of Russia intensified his fury at the Stalinist repression that in the 1930s to 1950s prohibited contact between Soviet citizens and foreigners such as himself. He opposed Soviet expansion after World War II, in part because it extended the domain of such secret police-dominated regimes. And yet, his love for what he regarded as the essence of Russia also bled into a measure of sympathy for the dilemmas of Soviet leaders. He understood their point of view in struggles with Washington. He even felt, on occasion, more Russian than American. What Kennan imagined as the wondrous mystery of eternal Russia appealed to deep-seated elements of his personality. Scarred by the loneliness he had endured as a motherless child, he longed for some enveloping maternal warmth. Also impelling him was a recurring desire to flee, somehow and somewhere, from the boredom and duty of his regimented daily life. His life pivoted not only from America to Russia, but between other worlds as well. He navigated between his own era of the 20th century and the 18th and 19th centuries, in which he would have felt more comfortable, or so he believed. Living in Milwaukee, Princeton, Riga, and Berlin from the 1910s to the early 1930s, he absorbed ugly biases he never could totally shake, and so in subsequent decades he would toggle between brilliant perception and blinkered prejudice. In his last years, dissatisfied with his limited influence in his own era, Kennan tried to shape the history written about him so that future generations would be receptive to his ideas and his life story. In still other ways, he stood betwixt and between. As a boy who had lost his mother at the age of 2 months, young George had to negotiate between maternal relatives who doted on him and his father, whom they despised. At class-conscious Princeton University, he pinched pennies, unaware of the extent of his inherited wealth. After getting engaged to a daughter of Washington insiders, he found himself cast aside and humiliated. He responded by throwing himself into his work in the State Department, where he rose faster than anyone else in his age cohort. Nevertheless, here too Kennan remained an outsider. He had chosen to study Russian language and history in Berlin, and he oriented himself towards Central and Eastern Europe. These choices seemed odd to the in-crowd in the State Department, who valued Paris and London as the foreign capitals normative in culture and central to diplomacy. For them, Berlin and points east figured as problem-causing and other. Even in the late 1940s, when his influence in Washington and Washington's influence around the world were rising meteorically, Kennan retained a degree of independence. Although he owed much to such powerful benefactors as Secretary of Defense James V. Forrestal, he operated largely on his own terms. As founding director of the policy planning staff in the State Department, the 43-year-old conducted staff meetings like a self-assured professor running a seminar. He alone crafted the influential policy papers for Secretary of State George C. Marshall, whose office adjoined his own. Kennan maintained a certain aloofness in his personal relationships, explained a former member of the planning staff. And this was true in his attitude toward foreign relations, too. He favored a dignity in dealing with foreign countries, not try to become too intimate with them. We get into trouble doing that. With regard to relations with the people of Russia, however, Kennan did seek such intimacy, at least for himself. George and his wife Annalise also kept some distance from the fashionable Georgetown set. Though they attended dinners and cocktail parties during the week, weekends they reserved for their 252-acre farm in East Berlin, Pennsylvania. Visiting diplomats could talk foreign policy with Kennan, but they had to do so while installing a trough in the pigsty, laying the foundation for a workshop, or otherwise making themselves useful. The devotion to the farm reflected Kennan's love of nature, his yearning for roots, and his element of Russian sensibility. The farm satisfies all my irrational demands for solidity and security, he explained to his sister after buying the property in 1942. It was just like the cherry orchard, without the orchard. The reference to the play by Anton Chekhov expressed George's reverence for the wisdom of this favorite Russian writer. Kennan shared Chekhov's root and branch critique of industrialism. The Russian argued that the basic problem of modern society was not that factory workers were exploited by capitalist titans or by Communist Party bosses, but rather that machine production itself exploited people and alienated them from each other and from nature. The tragic error of industrialism and of its twin, urbanization, bore much of the responsibility for the ills of contemporary society, Kennan believed. America needed a policy to prevent the plundering of the national treasures and the beauties of our own country, he declared years before the modern environmental movement took off in the 1970s. Kennan also favored personal rather than automatic interaction in matters large and small, whether it pertained to having operators rather than computers place telephone calls, or having porters rather than do-it-yourself baggage carts move luggage. As for transportation, Kennan believed that commuting by train encouraged a clustered community around the station, while the automobile furthered alienation by dispersing the population. In contrast to ships, transoceanic airplanes deprived the traveler of a gradual and graceful adjustment to the destination. He condemned advertising as lying. Often elusive and reclusive, he despised commercialization, declined to use a computer, and disdained other technological gadgets. Quirky yet wise, he remained difficult to understand. My father had a deep emotional life that was very regimented and repressed, Christopher Kennan concluded. There was a lot that he did not say. Regimenting his feelings was a response that young George had mastered in the stern household of his father and stepmother, where proper English was mandatory, and mentioning that puppies were born was deemed vulgar. Those parents had their sensitive, well-mannered sons skip a grade so that they could send him off to a military boarding school for problem boys. Slender and underage, George was bullied when starting out at St. John's, but toughened himself enough to survive and even thrive. He would forever after retain an inner distinctly masculine, regimenting voice that sounded much like the iron-handed disciplinarian of the school, Duke Smythe. Repressed was a term that George in his 20s and early 30s became familiar with as he absorbed the theories of Sigmund Freud. Kennan believed that the lives of men, he simply assumed the masculine gender was normative, were unavoidably wrenched by the struggle between eros and civilization. While eros in the form of sexual freedom, art, adventure, wonder, mystery, and strong emotion would always entice him, civilization as family, study, duty, achievement, and cold rationality would usually claim him, at least for a while. He saw the challenge as balancing these two forces. While unchecked eros led to chaos, unrelieved civilization deadened the spirit. With regard to international relations, Kennan emphasized reining in runaway emotions. He regarded containment as a means to check the offensive brashness of the Soviet Union after its stunning victory over Nazi Germany. He would likewise seek to calm Cold War hysteria in the United States. As a junior diplomat, Kennan had admitted that any demonstration of mass emotion always gives me a sinking sensation at the pit of the stomach. He saw such feeling as a revelation of the hopeless mixture of stupidity and good intentions that was the fate of humanity. And yet, in a fragment penned late in life on My Russians, he excused emotional intensity. Juxtaposed against the wild primitive brutality of the Russians was their most touching tenderness in personal relations. With their moral earnestness, their courage and endurance, and their faith, they put all us Westerners to shame. He extolled the Russians as emotionally, intellectually, and aesthetically one of the world's potentially greatest peoples. Despite his edging into the world of Russia, Kennan remained an American, and though he lived in Eastern and Central Europe for most of the 2 decades before 1946, summered in Norway, and mused in old age about retreating to rural Scotland, he remained in the United States for most of his 101 years. That lifespan from 1904 to 2005 encompassed a huge chunk of U.S. history. When Theodore Roosevelt, the president in 1904, was born in 1858, the oldest Americans had come into the world as subjects of the British Empire. George's father had accompanied his father on campaigns during the Civil War. At the time of Kennan's death, there lived Americans who, barring some global calamity, would survive into the 22nd century. Technology and international politics changed during Kennan's life in ways that often he did not find comfortable. At the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, held to celebrate the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase, visitors marveled at an early radio device, the X-ray machine, and an incubator for infants. 140 models of gasoline, steam, and electric automobiles vied for attention, as did airships that could barely fly. In a tribute to America's imperial expansion, the fair exhibited not only the defeated Apache leader Geronimo, but also the supposedly primitive Igorots of the Philippines. A week before George was born on February 16, Japan humiliated Russia with a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur in Manchuria. Russia's defeat in that war would trigger the aborted revolution of 1905, the eventual overthrow of the Tsar, and the rise of the Bolsheviks in 1917. Much had happened by the time of Kennan's death on March 17, 2005. The Bolsheviks in Russia had been cast aside, as had the militarists in Japan. China, the helpless victim of their rivalry, had risen to wealth and power. George's close friend J. Robert Oppenheimer, the atomic physicist and director of the Institute for Advanced Study, also born in 1904, had already been gone for nearly 4 decades. Over the course of Kennan's life, spending by the U.S. government ballooned from less than $1 billion a year to $2.5 trillion, while the population more than tripled from 82 million to 296 million. By instinct a conservative, Kennan regarded the expanded spending, especially on advanced weaponry, as wasteful. Reluctant to see Anglo-Saxons such as himself pass into minority status, and worried about the environmental and social impact of crowding, he deplored the increase in the number of people. Whole scenes and cultures that Kennan knew well would disappear during his lifetime. Always partial to trains, he marveled in the 1920s at the 5 layers of gleaming rails and thundering wheels converging at Pennsylvania Station in New York City. He also admired the roomy and sturdy Russian-built cars on the rails in Estonia. On an uneventful trip to that Baltic nation, Kennan observed in the carriage with him a couple of Jews, some natty Latvian officers, and others who remained unaware that they were unfortunate enough to live what a future historian would term the Bloodlands. The unrelenting killing of the Second World War would also incinerate Hamburg, the vibrant and gritty city that Kennan idolized as a goddess. There he could hear a multisonic, buzzing song in which all hope and all fear of humankind finds its expression. That melody, however, would be drowned out by the roar of the firestorm ignited by the Allies' incendiary bombs. Visiting the burnt-out shell of Hamburg after the war would turn Kennan against nearly all war. His opposition to most wars, along with his skepticism about American empire, industrialism, and globalization, set Kennan at odds with Cold War America, while making him newly relevant in our own time. It is Kennan's oddity, his penchant for thinking otherwise, that renders his voice important. This lyric mourner of a bygone age, this lover of Russia and permanent visitor to America, this fault-finder of modern and postmodern society, offers a skewed yet discerning critique of what most simply accept. Although often painfully estranged, Kennan never gave up for long on America, or on Russia, nor did he abandon hope of mutually beneficial relations between the people of these two rivals. As someone who longed for inclusion but seldom found it, and as a thinker who felt and thought too deeply for comfort, it was fitting that Kennan often referred to himself as bewildered. His was a life between worlds. We owe it to ourselves to try to understand him. Introduction. The famous X, the anonymous strategist who burst on the scene in 1946 to 1947 with a plan for blocking, even besting, the seemingly unstoppable Soviet Union, was soon identified as George Frost Kennan. The once obscure diplomat quickly rose to become America's top Russian expert and the founding director of the State Department's policy planning staff. Later, as an establishment icon dressed in an old-fashioned 3-piece suit with a heavy gold watch chain, Kennan would remain associated with the containment doctrine until his death at 101. Given this thumbnail sketch, how to account for Kennan's blubbering while watching a performance of Anton Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard, because the play stirred up my Russian self, which was more genuine than the American one. Even as this strategist championed rational realism in foreign policy, powerful emotions coursed through his personal and professional life. Though widely respected and honored by presidents and the public, Kennan judged his career a failure because he had been dropped as a pilot of U.S. foreign policy. A success at helping initiate the Cold War, he fizzled in trying to end it. In his mid-90s, he warned that expanding NATO eastward threatened democracy in Russia and renewed hostility with Moscow. This pioneering, even radical environmentalist pointed to the machine as the root cause of economic exploitation and environmental depredation. A devoted family man, Kennan repeatedly strayed from his marriage, despite the ensuing guilt. He viewed himself as a scion of an earlier time, cast astray in a 20th century world. Indeed, the abandoned child would remain the foundational story of his life. February through April were always difficult months for Kennan. It was not the weather. He loved the cold and early spring. But he hated revisiting the agony that had beset his mother, Florence James Kennan, from shortly after he was born on February 16, 1904, to her death from a burst appendix on April 19 of the same year. As a young boy, he suffered that pain partly out of the mistaken belief that she had died from the complications of his birth. As an adult, Kennan year after year would take sick or succumb to depression during those dark months. He would die on March 17, 2005. 2 years earlier, so crippled by arthritis that he could barely walk, he was lying in bed in his Hodge Road house in Princeton, New Jersey, and talking with Doug James, the son of his cousin and childhood best friend Charlie. Kennan was trying to put his long life into context. What accounted for his persistent longing for succor and intimacy? Reflecting on his mother, he lamented that he had been torn away from her breast. The violation was so abrupt and final that it affected me for life. Subconsciously, this was a trauma for myself and for her. Kennan, who regarded Freudian theory as settled science, blamed his restless quest for sexual intimacy as an adult on this rupture of maternal intimacy as an infant. What he referred to as my weakness stemmed from the shock of what happened to me as an infant. Kennan's lifelong yearning for deep familiarity and closeness, for union with some wondrous mystery and beauty, went far beyond sex, however. Long before he became America's foremost strategist on the Soviet Union during the pivotal years of the early Cold War, Kennan invested his desires in the people and culture of Russia. As both a rational strategist mapping out plans for containing and isolating the Soviet Union, and the emotional man beset by longing to connect with the Russian people, Kennan was wrenched almost unbearably. Though flawed in many ways, Kennan shines as an unsung hero of the Cold War. While most people focus on the inflammatory manifestos he penned in 1946 and 1947 that helped ignite the Cold War, they underplay his pivot in the opposite direction soon thereafter. In the 4 decades from 1949 to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Kennan, as U.S. government official and then as public intellectual, devoted his formidable talents to pushing for negotiations and compromise with the Russia that he would always love. His repeated pointing to this, and that opportunity for a settlement with Moscow, offers an alternate history of the Cold War, one in which that struggle, which always entailed the danger of nuclear Armageddon, might have ended decades earlier and more safely. Why Kennan the Cold Warrior was lauded as the all-wise grand strategist, and why Kennan the critic of that conflict was often dismissed as a sentimental poet, says much about the political culture and emotional sensibility of America. After the Cold War, Kennan presciently argued for bolstering Russia's fragile democracy with a new European-wide security organization that would replace NATO and mitigate the division between East and West. As a young boy, George was yanked away not only from his mother, but also from a succession of nurses, and most sorrowfully from cousin Grace Wells, whom he had wanted to call mother. She was a beloved relative of his mother, hired to care for George and his 3 older sisters. After 3 happy years, Grace had to leave when the children's father, Kossuth Kennan, remarried. These breaches scarred him, George would later believe. The emotional security of young George was shaken further by suspicions of an egregious infidelity committed by his father. Both temperament and training inclined Kennan toward privacy. He praised restraint even more than he practiced it. He regarded public displays of emotion and revelations of intimate secrets as vulgar. While his diary is rife with allusions to his various affairs and his subsequent guilt, he remained elusive as to details. Now, however, in this 2003 interview with Doug James, he opened up for the first time about a shocking scandal. When Florence Kennan at age 44 was dying in great pain from a burst appendix, her 3 young daughters were called in to kiss their feverish mother goodbye. Infant George nursed until almost the end. Florence's brother and sister-in-law, Charlie's parents, Alfred and Nellie James, and Florence's parents all hovered nearby. Conspicuously absent, however, was her husband. Uncle Alfred and Aunt Nellie suspected my father of being away for no good purpose, George explained. They believed he had another woman somewhere. Kent, however, would always claim that he had been on a hunting trip. I should have insisted on talking with my father about this before he died, the son realized too late. Shyness on both sides, and perhaps also this dark suspicion, had hampered meaningful communication between George and his father. While Uncle Alfred and Aunt Nellie were always very nice to me and to my sisters, they never forgave his father. Personality differences, financial tensions, and conflicts over Kent's later decisions to remarry and to send his son off to a military school further poisoned relations between the maternal and paternal sides of young George's family. Though he would live a long life, Kennan seems never to have gotten over this cratering of his emotional security. Losing his mother as an infant loomed as the defining story of his life, one he felt compelled to tell over and over. He emphasized the loss in his diary and memoir, to his authorized biographer, to his children, to caregivers, and in the final interview of his life. An astute observer of the adult George Kennan was Mary Atchison Bundy, a Princeton friend of the Kennans, and the daughter of Kennan's former boss, Dean Atchison. Her own son had suffered trauma when she was quarantined with tuberculosis during his first year. George liked Mary Bundy a lot, his daughter Grace would remember. Looking beyond the shell of George's outward sociability, Mary discerned a haunting sadness deep in him. It's an awfully big part of him. She added, "You don't have to go very far psychologically to discover that almost everything starts before you can even think." Kennan did go far, however, when it came to what he regarded as psychological science. He analyzed both his personal life and foreign policy issues in psychological terms. He kept a diary of his dreams, and he suspected that some were communications from an outside source. He had read Freud in a sanatorium in Vienna in 1935 while being treated, though not psychoanalyzed, by a Freudian-minded doctor. He believed that the life patterns of nations paralleled those of individual humans. As America's preeminent strategist on Russia in the 1940s, he diagnosed the Soviet Union as a neurotic, at times psychotic patient who needed calm management by policymakers such as himself, playing the rational doctor. The pervasive influence of Freudian theories in mid-20th century America gave credibility to Kennan's often reductive psychological explanations. Freud's Civilization and its Discontents had convinced Kennan that at the center of our psychic construction is a libido, the demands of which, as Freud has demonstrated, we ignore at our peril. Warring with the instinct to reproduce were the taboos and penalties of civilization. If a man, and Kennan nearly always regarded the male gender as normative, was caught between the cogs of nature and those of society, he would be rubbed to pieces. More than sexual freedom stood at stake. Kennan regarded the libido as the control switch for vitality.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?